Welcome to the Transformation Leaders podcast, and today I've got a gem for you. My guest is Shamila Mhearban, and honestly our conversation just flowed to the point that we still have so much more to cover. We may have to arrange for her to come back on a future episode. Shamila is a recognised expert in high performance leadership and a Forbes Council member, and shares her passion around a data-driven approach to understanding transformation leadership. I'm sure you're going to get so much value from this episode. Let me introduce you to Shamila now. Well, hello, Shamila. Welcome to the Transformation Leaders podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to exploring your philosophy on data-driven approach to and philosophy to leadership development, and how this can support and guide transformation leaders that are listening to this podcast. Before we get into that detail, tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, how you first got involved in change and transformation.
Right, Tony. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me here. My background is very much in the HR and people space. I've always worked with senior leaders in that space, very much in that. I think when we first spoke, we talked about change versus transformation. And this idea that I've always supported individuals and organizations grow through transformation, which is we've made something is different and we're never going to go back and to work in this new way. But when I was working in that space, one of the things that I realized as I'm working with senior leaders is, as a consultant, when you go into a business, there's lots of changes that you can make. You can make changes to their procedures, their processes, the way they do things. But what ends up being really impactful with leaders is when you make changes that far outlast your physical presence in that organization. And for me, that starts with challenging leadership mindset. It starts with the individual themselves. And I think when you're leading transformation or change, you can't do it unless you start with yourself first. And so that's what got me interested in coaching. That led me to leadership coaching. It was, how can I make sure that I have a legacy that far outlasts just the physical work that we might be doing? And from a coaching perspective, I think when you're supporting leaders navigate change, you can get some really interesting results when you really start getting into the mindset of the leader.
Absolutely. And that question around transformation and change leads me on to the first question that we ask everybody who comes onto the show. How do you define transformation?
I mean, transformation is something that happens when we commit to a better way of being, of doing things. And as a result of that newfound knowledge, insight, way of working, way of living, we don't go back. And we transform into something that's bigger than the moment that happened before it. And when that transformation happens, it also means the individuals in that transformation are genuinely engaged. Sometimes change can but not bring everyone along with them for the journey. But when real transformation happens, everybody who's part of that process is transformed to being different. And to me, that's how transformation really embeds itself as a long-lasting impact.
And in your experience, because that's a real challenge of bringing everybody on the journey, especially within large organizations. So in your experience with the organizations you've worked with, what sort of things have you helped leaders to implement that has allowed them and helped them to take more of the people on the journey with them, going through that significant change process?
I think it starts with, and it starts with the basics. I think when I'm working with leaders, what I start with isn't necessarily the outcome we're trying to achieve, but what's going to matter when we get there. It's the values piece that really makes an impact, right? And I think often when we think about inauthentic leadership, that individuals haven't bought into inauthentic leadership. That's why it's inauthentic. And because they haven't bought into it, they're not following it. And because they're not following it, really the leader is isolated. You can't be a leader unless individuals want to follow you. And so when I think about the most impactful change that I've had, honestly, it starts with the most simple thing, which is before anything happens, is you sit down and you clarify what's going to matter when we get there. And typically that's very grounded in an organization or an individual leader's values. And when you do that piece and draw that out, irrespective of how the outcome happens and how we get there, fundamentally, you know that when that end point comes, we've achieved what was supposed to happen because it was values based. I think often when change happens and people aren't along for the journey, you'll see a disconnect between the values of the organization, the leader who's leading that space, and the individuals who are being affected by it. There's a lack of alignment there.
And how have you found leaders respond to you in that respect? Because that will, in many cases, might be completely outside of their comfort zone to start talking about the values right up front, because the expectation will be, well, we're here to deliver outcomes or results. So, you know, how have people responded to you when you've sort of said, that's my focus and that's the approach we're taking here?
Yes, I think it depends on the work that's gone on, the conversations that have gone prior to that. I think if you go into an organization, just start at that point, inevitably, once again, you're going to get pushback because there isn't enough authentic dialogue that's been built up to have those conversations. I think I personally, I always start with asking, why are we here? Tell me about your previous attempts at transformation or change. What happened? Yeah. Where did that start? And I think when you give leaders or in any individual an opportunity to step out of the day-to-day priorities of the day-to-day that might be really affecting them and take that kind of broader view of what's happened in the past and what are the lessons that we've learned from it, how might that impact what happens in the future, and from that space, what are your learnings? Often it comes across quite organically. Leaders will themselves volunteer that, oh, we went through this process. It was really hard. It was really arduous. It was an 18-month project. And then when we got there, it didn't turn out how I wanted it to be. It wasn't what I expected. And I think often consultants are brought in because these things have happened in the past that haven't necessarily gone to plan. And so there's a missed opportunity if, as a consultant, you're not going in and getting the broader context of what happened in that organization that led to the conversation today. And as soon as you start picking up on that a little bit, it's very easy to see where change hasn't, or transformation hasn't happened in a way that supported the business needs.
Yeah. And I think, again, picking up on something you just said there, it's the lessons. What lessons can you take from failed initiatives or where the outcomes have not been what you expected? And all too often, although within a typical process, there'll be a process that's like lessons learned, people sort of skip over that, forget about that, and move on to the next thing. And there's so much, it's such an important element that is so often forgotten, and there's so much value in it if you run it properly. And I have a similar approach when I'm first engaging with a client. It is, well, tell us about what's keeping you up at night. Tell us about what you've tried. Tell us about why that you feel that hasn't worked effectively, and again, why we're here. And a lot of times, it doesn't necessarily come naturally for people to share that stuff. But it's like it's unpeeling that onion again, isn't it? It's just pulling back the layers and layers and layers until you get to the real core issue. And once you're there, it's like a light bulb's been switched on in the room.
Tony, I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, this isn't just think from an organizational perspective. This is a fundamental value, if you like, that I've built my coaching around, because I absolutely agree with you. I think even if we look at a lot of traditional coaching programs, there's this idea that we set goals and we're going to work towards them, and your coach is going to support you working towards those goals. And absolutely, there is an element of that. But actually, a coach cannot truly and effectively support you, I believe, unless they've developed some sort of dialogue shorthand on what are the lessons we've learned previously and how are those going to impact what's happening today. And so I think there's a lot of there's this idea around coaching that what is I write down goals and then I have an accountability partner, and that accountability partner is going to keep me on track to achieve my goals. And yes, that's a very small foundational part of effective coaching. But truly effective coaching takes the moment at the outset of a program to say, tell me a little bit about those lessons learned. Tell me a little bit about your biggest wins. What are the key things that we can pull out here that really served you? Lessons that potentially you do overlook in your day-to-day. And, you know, I have this sort of joke that I have with clients where I say, well, look, we're going to have a reflection of the lessons that you've learned over the last 12 months, but then we're also going to develop a little bit of a shorthand around it. So let's get a record of this. But what's like a 5-sentence thing that's going to remind you of this exact situation we've talked about, which might be happening as a pattern for you? And, clients come out with some really interesting stuff. Darn it, dude, you got this is a classic one, because there's a whole story of like this childhood character that this individual used to watch, and this, darn it, dude was a statement. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't connect to me at all. And yet when we're in coaching sessions, right, and you've got this kind of pushback and you're seeing these patterns emerge, it's not enough to say, oh, you've got that goal that you're working towards and I'm going to act. It's actually in that moment just being able to disrupt the dialogue by being like, darn it, dude, brings that lesson straight back. I'm not doing the work to say, do you remember about all of those different types? I'm literally giving my client that 5-word statement and immediately you see the penny drop.
I
love
that. It's those, I love that. Just those little trigger points, isn't it, around just getting them back into a state that they're starting to look at ways to move away from. So critical. So tell me.
So often we just.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, so often we just focus on what's right today, what's happening right in front of us. And going back to that transformation piece, the reason why the values piece is so effective is because it pulls individuals straight out of that day-to-day. They're straight out of the firefighting they might be in and going, actually, I've been here before. There are different ways of addressing this. Let me tap into that mindset rather than the firefighting mindset that I might have come into this conversation with.
Yeah, but that reminds me of an organisation I've done lots of work with over the years, and they were growing really, really quickly. They were winning new business, they were acquiring businesses, doing everything, and went from, they grew tenfold in 10 years, up to billion pound plus revenues. And their key people were very, very comfortable in the trenches and in the weeds, in the detail, and loved it. So that that was their comfort zone. Trying to take them out of that and saying, well, this is just becoming a repeatable process now. You do some work and then you get back in the mire again because you haven't actually resolved the core issues, or you haven't resolved what's causing all these problems to arise within contracts. So let's get your head above the parapet and let's start talking about a more structured solution that can. And they felt that they found that whole process really, really uncomfortable because their comfort zone was in that, and they were seen as heroes almost, because they were able to go in, sort the problem out, and come out with the cape on and walk out saying, yeah, I've sorted that out. Where's the next fire that I need to put out? And it's a mindset and it's a values thing, as you said right at the start. And it took so long to break them out of that. And to some extent, every now and again, it became the glass ceiling for their growth, because they just couldn't manage all of these fires simultaneously happening.
I think that connects so closely with what transformation really means for individuals and organizations. And it goes back to that earlier question. An organization might be going, hey, we've got this big transformation project. But isn't it such a valuable exercise to sit down with each individual leader or stakeholder in that and say, what does that transformation look like for you? What are you going to transform into that you don't go back to? What does that change look like for you that you commit to? Because once you have clarity on that, if you're committing to becoming, I'm going to become much more strategic, so my transformation is going to be in that strategic space, suddenly there's a different level of accountability. Whereas if you're always going, my job or how I feel happiest is when everyone around me is rewarding and recognizing me, sometimes that doesn't always lead to where we want to lead. It doesn't really, because over time, inevitably, when praise comes to us too often, we start to devalue it because we're human and that's what we do. Familiarity breeds contempt. So over time, you'll have many of those leaders who will ultimately dismiss the feedback from their team or the people around them over time and go, well, that doesn't mean anything. I'm still not good enough. And it comes because they haven't done that transformation piece within themselves. What matters to me when I get there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's go back. I'm quite keen to explore your sort of data-driven approach and philosophy that you talk about to leadership development, and understand a little bit more about that. So tell me a little bit about that and how you utilize that and to help leaders change in the environment that they're working in.
Well, one of the things that I've always found is observations are powerful. Data is even more so. Yeah. Data has impact in ways observation doesn't. And observations in a coaching and dynamic are really important. I've got my dog here trying to get attention from me, Tony. So, and at some point I can show him to the camera because he is very cute. But yeah, so when we talk about transformation from a leadership perspective and how by data, I realized when I first got into coaching, and this is quite a few years now, that there's a lot of coaches out there there's a lot of focus there on this idea of what I call vanity metrics. And I'm being very cautious in how I'm speaking right now, because I think, I'm not knocking what anyone else is doing. I talk about vanity metrics. What I mean is, are we setting goals? Did you feel heard in the conversation that you had? Did you feel like you had active questioning put back to you? Did you feel engaged with the session? And this is all really important information. But what it does is it takes away the recognition that real effective coaching isn't what happens inside a session. Mm-hmm. It's what happens outside the session that then informs what happens in the session itself. And so actually, if a leader or if an individual is only focusing on what they're feeling or processing in their coaching session, to me, that is vanity metrics, because we're not recording the ROI data outside of the process. And so I started looking at, what does that mean? If I don't want to collect vanity metrics, what is the information I'm looking at? And so it's around this mindset progression piece. I think often we don't realize that changes happened in ourselves. Mm-hmm. We might objectively look back and go, I feel differently to what I felt 12 months ago. But we don't really get the minute data that helps inform our intrinsic motivation. There is no better way of building momentum for the direction you're traveling in than to see the positive results of the direction you've already been traveling in. Yeah. And so for me, it was really key. Having that data was going to support the development of intrinsic motivation in the individuals I'm coaching. And when I'm doing that, I'm making them truly respond for the results that we gain through the coaching program. I really am removing myself from the process. Right. And that was really important. And I realized by doing that actually the outcomes that you achieve for your clients are no longer around how do I incrementally increase my performance from last year. That's actually not the kind of conversations I'm having with clients at all. It's how do I achieve my best year yet, with clarity on how I'm progressing towards that goal and clarity on what is the return on investment and the isolation impact of the work I did with my coach. So what it allows me to do and allows clients to do is completely take away this whole, was I heard, or the questions, the right sort of questions, which is important, but you know that when you're traveling in the right direction, and focus much more on what is the data around my mindset progression? How is it changed towards versus what it was towards what I wanted it to be? And how do I know that when I get there, that success is going to serve me? Well, we've done all of that work from the outset of the program. We've understood what this is the data points we're gathering. This is how we'll know. This is the check-in that we're doing every month. And I should also say that this is, I think, difficult to do in a traditional method. Mm. I deploy specifically developed software to do this, because I think traditional coaching, which just focuses on the conversation and the dialogue, which is really key, needs that technology piece to really support the development of awareness and intrinsic motivation in clients. So that's where, so the reason came from this. I wanted to be different to what everybody else was doing, but also, my motivation comes from having really aspirational goals. And so if a client is coming to me, what matters to me when I get there, and they're saying, well, I kind of want to really work on my prioritization. That's all great, but that doesn't really excite me. Come to me with your aspirations for your best year yet. Let's get that down. And then let's figure out a roadmap to deliver on that, getting the data along the way. That's,
It's interesting as you were talking there, the image that came into my mind, because I'm a visionary person, but the image that came into my mind was one of a satellite navigation system. So, because if you go in a car, you put a destination in, don't you? And you don't just wait for the next month until you find out if you're going to arrive at your destination. It's monitoring your journey all the way through and giving you guidance on whether to turn left on this junction or go straight on, or there's an impending obstacle coming up. Do something about it now. And that's what you're talking about, really. It's if I just put a destination in and said, "Oh, thanks, Shamila, I'll see you next month," I'm never going to get to my destination. I might do, but it's unlikely that it's a straight line. It's always a wiggly line, isn't it? So yeah, that was what came into mind. Does that make sense? Does that chime with you?
I love that, because also it's not just the turning left and the turning right, but it's the brakes, right? Think about it. You're going on a really long drive. And yes, the operational part goes, how am I going to get there? Is my car okay? And what's the route I'm going to take? And there absolutely is. But then there's the strategy part, which says, well, when do I need to stop? And what am I going to be stopping for? And what's going to affect my journey? And actually, when you can have a map, and a map can tell you, and that the map is the traditional coaching to say this is where you need to get to, and you can navigate your way. Absolutely. But you can make better and more informed decisions about when you should be stopping and how long you should be stopping for, if you have that clarity of data. And that's where data is really key. We've always known how to get from A to B. I always say to leaders who work with me, irrespective of whether you deploy me as your coach, you will get to where you're going to, because there's no way you've gone on this trajectory and you're not going to. The real question here is, how efficiently are we going to do that, and what's going to matter when you get there?
Yeah. So I can translate it into large-scale organizational transformations. Then, what sort of key lessons can you share now that leaders who are running transformation programs, change programs at the moment, can look to deploy within that structure? What are the 2 or 3 things that you would say, these are the things that you should be looking at, or these are ideas that you should explore a bit further?
I love that. I think the first thing that I would like to introduce is it's not just about the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, as you're doing it, is to recognize that really truly effective transformation, it doesn't happen top down from a business.
Yeah,
it happens, it brings the whole organization along. And so actually, one of the questions you might want to be asking yourself before you start is, how am I planning to bring the whole organization along? What are we doing? And so in that, how am I planning? Communication is key, which brings me to my second point. If we're not talking about the communication strategy as transformation is happening, what you're doing is you're basically talking out your ideas that you're going to implement down, which may or may not be bought into. It won't matter when you get there. What will matter when you get there is, how informed was everybody in the process? How much did you take them along the journey? So what is the communication strategy around that? What are you willing to share? What are you not going to share? What's the strategic thinking around that? And once again, how do both of those things, so how do leaders bring the whole organization along with them, and the communication strategy, how do they align with the value of that organization? Because if those aren't aligned, immediately there's going to be inauthenticity in the process. And as soon as there's inauthenticity, you've lost it. So I would say it all starts from, if you're already in that change or that transformation piece, stop, pause, check where's the communication strategy at. Is this a top-down drive, or is this genuinely happening at all levels of the organization? And how aligned is it with the values that we've put on a board somewhere? Does this really reflect us? And I wonder even if you're going through that change, you're seeing problems, that if you start comparing those 3 elements, that you might draw out some of the issues and where they might be sitting. So I would say, people first, right?
Yeah.
People. Effective change happens when procedures are important, but it's people first. Who's involved in it, how they're being informed about it, and what do they feel underpins what they do.
So playing devil's advocate a little bit, so that's my role here.
Oh, okay.
I'm running a large-scale global business, a transformation across a global business. 3 continents, 20 countries, 20,000 people. Yeah, you're asking me to talk to every one of those 20,000 people, get input from every one of those 20,000 people? Really?
It's a great, I love the fact that you asked. And you know what my response to that would be? Do you really believe you're the answer for this whole organization? Absolutely, you can't do that. There's a capacity issue there completely, but also goes back to that individual wanting to be the answer. So straight away, it's about, when we say bringing other people along with you in the journey, it's about creating champions across the organization who are going to be able to feed into that. Well, of course, one person can't do it, but the reason why one person can't do it is because one person can't enact change or transformation. And straight away, even when you hear that type of thinking, it tells you where the organization and leader themselves are at. There's still the work that needs to happen is the transformation piece for themselves. You can't be the answer in this context. So if you can't be the answer, and that's where you normally get value from, where else can you get value from? Because if we can connect that with how you feel good. So is it that you want to be the driver for this change? Is it someone that you want to be the overseer? Do you want to be the information person for this drive? What's the role you want to play? And then let's check that in with other individuals. But often when people worry about I and they focus on that I, what I'm hearing is you're really not thinking about that organization as a whole. Where are the champions? And then it works in organizations' favors to think like this as well, because from a succession planning piece, you don't just pluck individuals out of thin air to get into senior leadership roles. I mean, some organizations do, but that doesn't necessarily always serve those organizations. And so when we think about the champions, what is the talent we want to keep in the business? How do we want to develop it? And if we want to develop in a certain way, what do we need to expose it to? How can we use this opportunity to expose that talent so that they can continue to be champions and hopefully future leaders? But it's really interesting the amount of times actually, and I'm very, because I smiled as you said it, Tony, because I've had these conversations actually, and it's really interesting. And it's almost, well, do you think it's possible? How can we make this possible?
Yeah.
Because you can't be the answer.
I totally agree, and I use a lot of sporting analogies when I'm working with clients. And I remember a book that I read probably 20 years ago. It was written by Sir Clive Woodward, Winning, and he was the coach of the England rugby team that won the World Cup back in 2003, I think it was, or maybe 2003, I think it was. And he was talking about how he created a number of leaders within his team. And so there was a leadership team, and within that leadership team, there was a leader for the defense, there was a leader for the attack, there was a leader for all these different things. And within those individual teams, there was leaders. So everybody within the team had a leadership type of role, and they were there to create their own objectives, to create their own rules, to create their own ways of working, but spent a lot of time communicating what it was that we tried to do to win the World Cup. And it was over an 8-year period. So they got to the semi-final in the first World Cup that they went to, and ultimately failed in their objective. But again, they used that as a learning experience to go on to the next one and win. And the organisation I was working for at the time, when I read this, I went out and bought about 20 books and gave copies to the team, because there's so many lessons that we could apply into an organisation, and that's still relevant today. And it's fascinating, as you say. As a coach or as a leader, you can't play every position on the pitch, but you can support and guide and establish a team of people that are leading their teams of people that can then cover the majority of places on the pitch. And that's the key to, as you say, take people on that journey and ultimately deliver the outcomes that you've set out to deliver, I find.
I love that. And I think as we also need to be really careful though, because I love what you've just said, and it's very based in this positive space. But I also think, leaders, we're all human, right? And we have fears. We have fears about our skills being obsolete. We have fears about not being able to deliver, not having the answer. And I think this not having the answer is a particular one. And actually, there's an analogy that I use with a lot of leaders when I'm talking about making this shift. And I'm going to go with me now, Tony, but I use this analogy where I say, well, okay, let's pretend you're visiting a national park, right? We're visiting a national park that you have never been to before, Tony. And you say to me, look, Shamila, I'd really like to go. So name a national park you'd like to go to. Any national park.
Well, the one I know is the Lake District because it's just up the road from where I am. But
wow, we're going to pretend you've never been there before.
Yeah.
And you've just said, I really want to visit the Lake District. And I, because I'm that sort of person, said, you know what, Tony? I know the Lake District really well. I'll meet you there. Let's meet at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. And we're going to meet you there and I'll show you around the park and you're really excited. And so you get there at 8:30 a.m. the next day. And I've been awful. I've stood you up. No call, no nothing. Not even an acknowledgement. I've stood you up. You're like, great. And you haven't come with a map because you thought I was coming with a map. You've literally come with yourself. And as you're standing there, you look a little bit lost because you don't know what you're doing. Somebody comes up to you. And they say, hi, you look a bit lost. You're like, yeah, I am. I've never been here before. And this individual says, okay, what's your name? Tony? Right, Tony, really nice to meet you. Don't worry, I'll show you around the park. And so you immediately get this sense of, oh, okay, at least there's somebody else here. And you're like, okay, thanks very much. And they're like, have you thought about what path? Do you know about any of the paths? And you're like, yes, there's one to the left here. I've just spotted. And the individual goes, no, Tony. I know this park really well. You don't want to take that path. That's a good path for you. Let's take this path to the right. It's going to be way more adapted to your to the way that you can move and the fitness level that you have. Let's go. I'm sure. And as you're going through this path, the individual might say, look, there's a scrambly bit coming up. Like there's a rope here, make sure you grab the rope. Have you got the right shoes? Get the right shoes on. And there's a wet bit coming up and they're telling you how to go through the muddy bit. And after a period of time, which you don't know how much time has passed, but apparently it's 8 hours because this person turns around to you and says 8 hours have passed. They say, we're at the park now. Have you enjoyed this journey? Mm-hmm. And you made your way from one side of the park to the other, but you very much followed the map that this individual set out for you. And you did it in exactly the way that they mentioned. And you were successful in your trip, but you were successful in their version of what your trip should have been.
Yeah.
We're going to go back to the beginning of this national park. I've been really poor. I said to you, I'll meet you a second time. And you've forgotten what this national park looks like. And this time I said 8:30 p.m. And I still stood you up. And you arrive at the park and it's getting dark. And this time there's nobody there. And you find a flashlight on the floor. And you check it, and it works. Luckily, you shine it around, and it shows you a path in front of you. And you decide to take that path. And you follow that path. And over time, as you're going on your journey, the flashlight keeps illuminating information that may or may not be relevant to your journey. But you get to decide. Mm-hmm. And over time, period of time, because you decide, I'm going to set my flashlight down now. I've done enough for the day. And you figured out a route to the other side of the park in your own way. You set it. But the thing is, Tony, a lot of individuals, a lot of leaders focus on being the guide. Mm. They focus on the fact that I'm going to get you to the other side of this national park and I have all the answers. But here's the thing about that guide. If you pop them down in any other national park, anywhere else in the world, they won't have any value because they won't know the answer. But if you take that flashlight and pop it in any national park in this world, that flashlight will continue to have value. I think the question a lot of leaders fail to ask themselves is, do I want to be a guide or do I want to be a flashlight? Mm. And the moment you put that to them in that way, they recognize that their skills as a leader is way beyond just knowing the answers. It's about allowing each individual that they lead to find their own route to success. And when we can do that as leaders, we truly transform the environments that we're in.
Powerful. I like that. I like that story a lot. Very, very powerful. Although I would have a complex at the end of it, I'm sure.
But actually, you're right, Tony. You're right. It creates this like feeling inside you, right? Of, oh, I don't want to be the guide. I definitely want to be the flashlight. And that's where the intrinsic motivation comes in. Mm. Because the moment in that where you can get someone to pivot to go, oh my God, I don't want to be there. I definitely want to be that. Yeah. I'm not doing the work to get someone there. I'm just showing them two images. and they get to decide which one they want to walk towards. And that's, I think, when really effective coaching happens, when you're not leading.
But I think there's a real lesson in that we can apply into general sort of transformation initiatives within organizations. One, from a leader's perspective, absolutely. But how many times do we see change teams or comms leaders, communication leaders, laying out that path, that this is the way you've got to go, and actually just allowing them to walk their own path and guiding them and providing those guardrails as they go to make sure that they get there in a safe way? Absolutely. That's much more powerful because they've got ownership of it then, haven't they? And that's the key thing that you want to do when you're trying to embed any change, is allow the individuals that are going through that change to take ownership of it. Far easier. It's much easier for them to pull change into an organization than it is for you to ever push it in.
Absolutely. It's also how you create sustainable change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because if you're only focusing on one side of it, you know that there's not going to be sustainable. So how we create sustainable change is giving opportunity to recognize that, right?
Yeah, and that leads us back to a conversation I think we had before we came on air about the ongoing change initiatives that are happening within organisations, and the fact that, in my belief, is the chief transformation officer should have a place on the C-suite within organisations, because change is constant. Evolution of organisations is getting quicker and quicker and quicker. And that drive to, as you say, provide the guidance, provide the floodlight, the flashlight, to help people navigate that on an ongoing basis becomes even more critical in this fast-paced world that we're living in.
And also in this world that we don't always have the answers in. I think, as you know, the future world of work, and if you look at how technology is developing, we're becoming ever increasingly going to be working in a world where we don't know the answers. Where we don't know what's going to happen next. And if a leader goes in and says, this is the way we're doing things, what they're also doing is creating a ceiling based on their own vision, based on their own abilities of what can be achieved. And there's nothing more depressing, personally, I feel, than somebody limiting the capabilities of a whole group of people, a team or collection of people, based on the limits of their own horizon. And so actually, when we talk about sustainable leadership, the future of leaders is around becoming flights. It's not around being guides. That's happening. That's real. And so from that perspective, that's the future. Then how do we support leaders lead in that space without knowing the answers?
As I said when we first spoke a couple of weeks ago to plan for this session, it would fly by. It has. I've just noticed the time. So to bring us towards the close, our sort of traditional final question is, what's your number one sort of essential elements, your non-negotiable, when you're working with leaders to drive that mindset change?
Whether they want it. My non-negotiable is, if I'm talking to a leader who is still in the mindset of how do I improve in my previous year's performance, I'm speaking to somebody who's thinking too small. And I know that and there's lots of coaches who can work with you in that space, but in terms of, for me, what I'm really engaged with is I'm working with individuals who are going, I've never done this before. I don't know if this has been done before. I think this is possible. And this is what my best year yet would look like. Right. And so for me, that clarity and broadness of vision is what really excites me and engages me. And I'm sure there's lots of other little things, but that's the main thing. How big is your vision and how much does it excite me? Because if I'm not there with you, if you can't take me alongside with you in your most aspirational outcome, I would be concerned about your commitment to it. Yeah,
it reminds me of a podcast I was listening to just the other day, and I can't remember the guy that was being interviewed, but he was talking about, I'll dig it out, but he was talking about you need to have it's the energy that you put behind your vision and sort of your goal that really matters. If your energy is 9 out of 10, just you may as well not bother. It has to be a 10 out of 10. You need to be really going for it, and they were talking about one of the things they were talking about is productivity and having a to-do list. And I said, forget about your to-do list, forget about productivity, get your energy right and really focus upon the things that you're most energized by, and you'll naturally enjoy the process. But you've been wanting to learn and adapt and take on new things because you're really, really sort of vibrantly energized about achieving it. And I think that's a little bit about what you were talking about there, isn't it? If you're asking me what do I want to do, and I come back with an 8 out of 10 response, you're like, I'm not the person.
I love that. So I've worked with a really great coach, a guy called Andrew Duncan, who's part of a broader team, works for New Level Results. And I remember we were doing some work together, and he talked about this idea of how committed are you, how energized are you, discussed. And and he gives it a level. And this is something I've learned from him, and I deploy it in my own programs. But he says, tell me, out of 5, how committed are you? And you'd be so surprised. The number of people who won't say 5, by the way, is classic. Everyone kind of goes 4. And his response, and it stopped me in my tracks, and I now use it. And he said, when was the last time you cleared a 5-meter jump with a 5-meter gap with a 4-meter jump?
Yeah.
Tell me about the last time that happened.
Great.
So it never happens.
Yeah.
And the moment that's never happened. Okay, so you're coming to this with a plan that you are telling me that it's a 5-meter gap and you've got a 4-meter jump prepared. That's what you're committing to. So are we going to make it? Probably not. Let me know when you come back to 5. And it's quite blunt, and I really like his style. But it's so true.
Yeah.
It's how often do we go into something? And so actually that's a key part of my program. Once we've got that roadmap, once we've got what's going to matter when we get there, that is a question I ask every client. And if anyone's listening, feel free to hold me accountable to this, because that's what we do. I ask every client, out of 5, what is your commitment to this? And they always are that little bit reluctant.
Yeah.
And so, I never cleared a 5-meter gap with a 4-meter jump. We're not going to start now.
Brilliant.
You bring that clarity away.
A great way to bring this fascinating session to an end. Thank you very much. I think there's so many takeaways from this session, and I'm sure there's lots of value that our listeners will get. So thank you very much.
Tony, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Shamila, what an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. We could have gone on for many hours, I'm sure. Thank you for listening to this podcast. We are always interested in hearing from you. What do you find useful from this pod? What do you want us to explore more in the future? Please do press the subscribe button. It helps us to reach more people and share the experience of all my guests. See you soon. Bye for now.